On a bitter January night in 1837, Catherine Brennan sat stiffly in the corner of a locked upstairs room at Sweetwater Plantation. A single oil lamp flickered beside her, throwing long, trembling shadows against the walls. In her lap lay a blank ledger. In her hand, a pen that would not stop trembling. Across the room stood her husband, Nathaniel Brennan. His pale gray eyes were cold and distant, as if the events about to unfold were concerning livestock rather than human lives. He gave Catherine exact instructions, what she was to watch, what she was to measure, and precisely what she was to record. The young woman brought into that room was named Ruth. She was 23 years old, terrified, powerless, and though Catherine wore silk instead of chains, she too knew she had no choice. What began that night would not end at sunrise. It would stretch on for years, transforming a Georgia plantation into something far darker than even the harsh norms of slavery. It would draw in a physician from Charleston, obsessed with twisted ideas of improvement. It would connect wealthy men who whispered about bloodlines and profit. And it would create a secret so corrosive that it would eventually devour every soul involved in sustaining it. Before we go further into what happened at Sweetwater Plantation, make sure you subscribe to The Lost Voices and turn on notifications. We tell the stories history tried to erase, and you won't want to miss what comes next. In the comments, share which city or state you're listening from. Our community spans the country, and we read every message. To understand the nightmare, we must understand the place. In the 1830s, Milledgeville served as Georgia's capital, a town of red clay roads, white-columned buildings, and parlors thick with cigar smoke and political ambition. 20 miles to the northeast, along the slow bend of the Occoquan River, Sweetwater Plantation spread across nearly 2,000 acres of cotton fields and pine forest. The main house, built in the federal style, stood on a gentle rise. From its second-floor gallery, Nathaniel Brennan could survey nearly everything he owned, and he believed strongly in ownership. He had inherited Sweetwater in 1832, at just 28 years old, along with dozens of enslaved men, women, and children. He was lean, sharp-featured, meticulous. Unlike other planters who sometimes worked alongside their field hands, Nathaniel rarely dirtied his boots. He preferred ledgers to plows, agricultural journals to conversation. He wrote letters to men in Charleston and Savannah, discussing scientific management and resource optimization, words that applied as easily to human beings as to crops. Catherine Haywood married him in the spring of 1834. She was 19, educated beyond what was typical for women of her class. She could read Latin, play the pianoforte, and balance household accounts with precision. Her dark eyes were keen, thoughtful. She had grown up in comfort, the daughter of a prosperous merchant. At first, life at Sweetwater seemed almost orderly. Dinners were hosted, political alliances strengthened. The scent of beeswax and lavender filled the halls in summer. Catherine tended medicinal herbs in her garden, using them to ease fevers and childbirth pains among the enslaved women. Small mercies in a system built on cruelty. But by their second year of marriage, whispers began. There were no children in a society that measured a woman's worth by heirs. Silence in the nursery echoed loudly. At church gatherings, questions came wrapped in polite smiles. Nathaniel never accused her directly, but Catherine noticed the tightening of his jaw whenever friends spoke proudly of their sons. In the autumn of 1836, Nathaniel summoned a physician to Sweetwater. The examinations lasted days. Catherine later wrote that she felt less like a wife and more like a specimen. When the doctor finally gave his conclusion, it was not to her, but to Nathaniel behind closed study doors. She would never conceive. Whatever flaw existed in her body, the doctor claimed, made motherhood impossible. Catherine expected anger, perhaps blame. Instead, Nathaniel became quiet, controlled, and deliberate. He paid the doctor generously, saw him off politely, and that evening, over a dinner served in complete silence, Nathaniel told his wife he had been reading extensively. What he had been reading would shape everything that followed. and what Catherine would be forced to record in that ledger would remain at Sweetwater forever. He had corresponded with men in Charleston who studied what they called natural philosophy, the science of heredity and breeding. If Catherine could not give him an heir through natural means, he would pursue alternative methods that were, he assured her, perfectly legal under Georgia law and widely practiced, if not openly discussed, throughout the South. Catherine understood immediately what he meant. The practice was indeed common, though rarely admitted openly. Planters who wanted to increase their labor force without buying more enslaved people would father children through enslaved women. These children, inheriting their mother's status, regardless of their father's race, would themselves become property. Some planters kept these arrangements discreet, others were blatant, but what Nathaniel proposed went far beyond ordinary exploitation. He wanted her involved. He wanted her present. He wanted her to document everything. The first woman Nathaniel selected was Ruth, 23 years old, tall and strong from years of field work. On a cold January night in 1837, Nathaniel had Ruth brought to a room on the east side of the main house, a room once used for storing linens, but converted for this purpose. He ordered Catherine to be present, to observe, to take notes on Ruth's physical traits, her health, her demeanor. Catherine's diary entry from that night was brief, the handwriting unsteady. God forgive me. I did as he commanded. I sat in the corner with pen and paper while my husband destroyed what remained of my dignity and Ruth's humanity. She did not cry out. I think that was the worst part, the silence. But Nathaniel's plan was even more elaborate than Catherine first realized. Over the following weeks, she discovered he had been reading extensively about selective breeding theories discussed in agricultural journals and medical societies. These ideas, which would later be recognized as pseudoscientific racism, suggested that human beings could be improved through careful selection of breeding pairs, much as one might breed horses or cattle for desired traits. Nathaniel had decided to run an experiment. Spring of 1837 brought unseasonable warmth to Baldwin County. The dogwoods bloomed early, filling the woods around Sweetwater with white blossoms that fell like snow in the slightest breeze. Catherine walked among them one morning in late March, crushing petals beneath her boots, trying to find some fragment of peace in the natural world, because there was none inside the walls of her home. Ruth was pregnant. Catherine confirmed it herself. Recognizing the sign she had once hoped to see in her own body, Nathaniel received the news with satisfaction, making a note in the Leith, R-bound book he had begun keeping, a ledger separate from the usual plantation records. Catherine glimpsed it once when he left it on his desk. The pages were divided into columns with headings that made her stomach turn. Physical traits, estimated intelligence, projected value, disposition, breeding potential. But Ruth was only the first. In April, Nathaniel selected another woman, Grace, who was just 19. Then in May, a woman named Dinah, who worked in the kitchen. Catherine was required to be present each time to observe and record. She developed a system of dissociation, a way of separating her mind from what her eyes saw. She would focus on irrelevant details, a crack in the plaster wall, the sound of night insects outside, the smell of lamp oil burning low. Anything but the horror in front of her. The other enslaved people at Sweetwater knew what was happening. Of course, they could not know. No, the women selected moved through their daily work with hollowed eyes. The men who were husbands, brothers, or friends could do nothing, their anger forced into silence by the ever-present threat of violence or sale. The plantation's atmosphere changed. Where there had been the usual rhythms of forced labor and coerced cooperation, now there was something darker, a tension that hummed beneath every interaction. And then in July, a visitor arrived who would turn Nathaniel's private obsession into something more systematic and sinister. Dr. Turn. Cornelius Harrov came to Sweetwater on a Thursday afternoon, his carriage rattling up Oakline Drive, trailing red dust. He was affiliated with the Medical Society of South Carolina in Charleston, though Catherine later found his credentials were unclear. At best, Harrov was in his 50s, portly, with mutton chop whiskers and soft hands that probably never delivered a difficult birth or set a broken bone. His specialty, he explained over dinner, that first evening was what he called anthropological medicine, the study of racial traits and their transmission through bloodlines. Nathaniel had been corresponding with Harov for months, ever since reading one of the doctor's papers in a Charleston medical journal. The paper, titled Observations on the Hereditary Transmission of Physical and Mental Characteristics in the Negro Race, proposed that through careful documentation and selection, planters could cultivate more valuable, enslaved populations. It was pseudoscience of the vilest kind, but taken seriously in some circles, published in respected journals, discussed in the parlors of educated men who believed they were advancing human knowledge. Harov stayed at Sweetwater for 3 weeks that summer. He examined every enslaved person on the plantation, measuring skulls with brass calipers, noting the texture of hair, the shape of noses, the color of eyes. He conducted interviews, though calling them that made it sound more dignified than it really was. He asked questions aimed at assessing intelligence and temperament, then wrote down his conclusions in dense paragraphs, filled with scientific-sounding terminology. Catherine was required to help him, to hold his tools, to record his measurements in a separate ledger he had brought. She watched him work with growing horror. He paid particular attention to the children already born at Sweetwater, measuring them with the same cold precision, predicting their future value and usefulness. He spoke about them as if they were a crop to cultivate, variables in an experiment to optimize. In the evenings, Hartgrove and Nathaniel would sit in the study, the door closed, voices low. Catherine learned to listen at the door, though what she heard made her wish she hadn't. They were planning something bigger than Nathaniel's original project. Harov knew other planters. He said men of vision who understood that the future of Southern wealth depended on the scientific management of their human property. A network could be built. Information could be shared. Children with desirable traits could be traded or sold to continue certain bloodlines. It was Ruth who first told Catherine about the other thing happening, the thing even worse than the breeding program itself. Ruth came to Catherine one morning in late August, while Nathaniel and Harov had gone into Malikville for the day. Ruth was 4 months pregnant, her condition beginning to show beneath her loose work dress. She stood in the doorway of Catherine's morning room, twisting her hands, clearly terrified, but driven by something stronger than fear. "Mrs. Fart." "Ruth," Catherine said quietly. "I need to tell you something about the babies, the ones that were born here before you arrived." Catherine's breath caught. She had assumed, though never asked directly, that other children had been fathered by Nathaniel or his father over the years. It was too common to even remark upon. But the fear in Ruth's eyes suggested something darker. "Tell me," Catherine said. "Master Brennan, he's been selecting certain babies," Ruth continued, "the ones with lighter skin, different eyes, or other features Dr. Haravro was looking for. After they're born and their mothers recover, men come in wagons at night and take the babies away. They tell the mothers they are being sold, but never say where. We ask other folks at neighboring plantations when we visit, and none of them have ever seen these babies." The room seemed to tilt. Catherine gripped the arm of her chair. "How many?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 20, 25 over the years. It started before the old Master Brennan died, but it increased after Dr. Harov began coming around." Catherine dismissed Ruth with a trembling hand and sat, alone in her morning room as sunlight slowly crept across the floor. She thought of Nathaniel's ledger, the one with columns for projected value. She thought of Harav's network of planters, his talk of optimizing bloodlines, and she understood with sudden sickening bloodlines that what was happening at Sweetwater was not just about producing more enslaved workers for profit. It was something that treated human children as experimental subjects, as merchandise to be distributed according to some grand design that existed only in the twisted logic of men who believed science justified their atrocities. That night, when Nathaniel returned from Malikville, Catherine confronted him. It was the only time in their marriage she directly challenged him. She asked about the children, about where they went, about what he and Harv were truly doing. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes cold in the lamplight. Then he backhanded her across the face, hard enough to split her lip. She fell against the settee, tasting blood, hearing him say in his calm, reasoned voice, "You will never question me again, Catherine. You are part of this now. Your observations, your records, they are essential to the work. You are complicit. If you speak of this to anyone, if you try to interfere, I will have you committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. I have already spoken to a judge, who is a friend of mine. One word from me, and you will spend the rest of your life in chains, treated as the mad woman you are threatening to become." Catherine wiped the blood from her mouth and said nothing. But something shifted that night. Some final thread of submission snapped. If she was complicit, if she could not escape or expose this without destroying herself, then she would find another way. She would become something other than a victim. She would become an instrument of justice, slow, careful, and deadly. The late summer of 1837 brought storms that battered the Georgia Piedmont with rain and lightning. Cotton crops rotted in the fields across Baldwin County. Planters gathered at the courthouse in Milledgeville, their voices tight with worry over markets, yields, and the labor needed to salvage what they could. Nathaniel attended these meetings, playing the part of concerned neighbor, while privately his attention stayed fixed on his experiment, which the weather could not disrupt. Grace gave birth in September to a boy with unusually light skin and eyes that would settle into a gray-green shade. Harv was present for the delivery, examining the infant with the same cold precision he applied to everything, making notes in his journal. Nathaniel was pleased. "This child," he told Catherine, "shows exactly the traits we are cultivating." Within a week, men came at night, as Ruth had described. Catherine watched from an upstairs window as they loaded a bundle into a covered wagon and drove away down the south road. Grace had 2 days to recover, then was sent back to the fields. She moved like something broken, her milk-swollen breasts bound tight beneath her dress, her eyes focused on nothing. By then, Catherine had begun her own records. While Nathaniel and Harv kept official notes, Catherine started a secret diary that went beyond simple observation. She recorded the women's names, their children's names, approximate birth dates. She noted which children disappeared and tried to find patterns. She also began studying the medicinal herbs in her garden with renewed purpose, reading the books her mother had given her about natural remedies. She focused on plants with cumulative effects, substances that could cause illness slowly, impossible to distinguish from natural ailments. Foxglove, which grew wild in the woods around Sweetwater, for example. In small doses, it could strengthen a failing heart. In slightly larger doses, administered regularly, it could cause weakness, confusion, nausea. Slowly poisoning someone without detection required patience and precision. Catherine had both. By October, Ruth gave birth to a girl. This child had darker skin, more typical features. Nathaniel seemed disappointed. Harv examined the baby and made notes, his tone suggesting this one was less valuable to their purposes. No men came for this child. She stayed with Ruth, given the name Martha. Catherine felt a small, obscene relief that this baby at least would remain with her mother, even though remaining meant a life of enslavement at Sweetwater. Danina's labor came in November and went badly. The baby, a boy, was born dead. Danina hemorrhaged, and despite Catherine's attempts to help, died 3 days later. Athreen cleaned the blood from Danina's quarters herself, her hands shaking as she scrubbed. She had genuinely tried to save her, used every skill she had, but it was not enough. The guilt was crushing. She had stood by and watched Danina be violated, recorded it in Nathaniel's ledger, and now the woman was dead. Catherine vomited into a bucket in the laundry room, emerging with her face composed, because showing weakness was forbidden at Sweetwater. Nathaniel seemed more annoyed by the loss than grief. He had invested time and resources in Danina's pregnancy, and the result was nothing. He made a note in his ledger about complications to avoid in future selections. Harav suggested examining Danina's body to determine the cause, but Nathaniel overruled him. The enslaved community needs to see at least the pretense of respect for their dead, he said, or there will be problems with morale and efficiency. They buried Danina in the small cemetery behind the quarters, a plot marked with wooden crosses and rough stones. Catherine attended the burial, standing apart from the enslaved people, who sang in low voices. She watched Ruth holding baby Martha, watched the women touch Grace's shoulder in silent solidarity, watched the men standing with fists clenched, faces carefully blank. She felt their hatred directed at her as much as Nathaniel, and did not blame them. She was complicit. She had done nothing to stop it, but she was preparing. Each week she collected small amounts of foxglove leaves, drying them carefully, grinding them to powder. She added them in tiny quantities to Nathaniel's evening whiskey, not enough to make him obviously ill, just enough to gradually weaken him. She told herself it was justice. She told herself she was doing what had to be done. The truth was more complicated. She was becoming something she did not recognize, fueled by rage, guilt, and a desperate need to strike back at the man who had turned her into a witness to atrocities. Winter arrived early that year. By December, frost had killed the last of the garden plants. Catherine collected the final foxglove seeds, storing them carefully for the next year. She had learned patience. Revenge, she realized now, was not a sudden act, but a long campaign. She could wait. She had nothing but time and hatred to sustain her. Harav returned to Sweetwater for the Christmas season, bringing documents that he and Nathaniel studied in the locked study. Catherine did not know what those papers contained, but she sensed they were connected to the network Harav had mentioned. Connections with other plantations, other men conducting similar experiments. She pictured a web spreading across the South. Children moved like chess pieces, all in the name of some grand theory about racial purity and scientific progress, which was really just cruelty dressed in academic language. On Christmas Eve, the enslaved people were given a holiday. As was customary, they gathered in the quarters for their own celebration, as much as could be found under the circumstances. Catherine watched from the house as they sang, and tried to find moments of joy despite everything. Ruth held Martha close, swaying to the music. Grace stood alone at the edge of the group, staring at nothing. Catherine turned away from the window and poured herself a glass of wine, her hands steady now. She had moved past horror into something colder and more resolute. The new year of 1830 arrived with freezing rain that turned the roads to mud, keeping everyone confined. Nathaniel and Harav spent long hours planning the expansion of their project. Catherine devoted her time to documenting everything, building her secret record, and adding tiny doses of poison to her husband's drinks. The foxglove was working, but slowly. Nathaniel had begun complaining of fatigue, occasional nausea, a general malaise he attributed to the winter weather. No doctor was called. Why would he summon one for something so minor? Catherine smiled at him over the breakfast table and asked if he wanted more coffee. He did. She poured it carefully, her hands perfectly steady, and watched him drink it down. What should Catherine do next? Could you maintain the same calm in her situation? Let us know in the comments. And if this story is gripping you, hit that like button and share it with someone who enjoys dark historical tales. Let's continue uncovering what happened at Sweetwater Plantation. March of 1838 brought a false spring to Middle Georgia. Warm days coaxed early buds from the fruit trees before late frosts killed them. Nathaniel's health continued its gradual decline. He moved more slowly now, complained of weakness in his limbs and difficulty concentrating. Catherine suggested he see a doctor in Milledgeville, but he refused, insisting it was merely lingering effects of winter. His pride would not allow him to admit vulnerability. Harav noticed during his April visit. The doctor examined Nathaniel in the study, Catherine absent for once, and emerged looking concerned. He recommended reduced physical activity, better nutrition, perhaps a tonic. He wrote a prescription for a compound that could be obtained from an apothecary in town. Catherine collected it and filled it, but she also began reducing the foxglove doses. She did not want Nathaniel dead. Yet, she wanted him weak, dependent, unable to continue his breeding program with the same vigor. She wanted him to suffer as she had suffered, to lose control of his body as he had taken control of others. But her plans were complicated by a new development. 2 women were pregnant again, Ruth for a second time, and a woman named Pearl, a chambermaid in the main house. Pearl was 26, educated by previous owners who had taught her to read before economic troubles forced her sails south. She was intelligent, observant, and Catherine had noticed how Pearl watched everything, filing away information as if she too were keeping records. Catherine began to feel a strange kinship with Pearl, though they never acknowledged it openly. Both were trapped in Sweetwater's nightmare, both documenting it in their own ways, both waiting for something to change. When they passed in hallways, Pearl's eyes would meet Catherine's for just a moment, a communication without words. They understood each other. It was Pearl who finally told Catherine about Samuel. One morning in late April, when Nathaniel and Harav had ridden into Milledgeville for a meeting with other planters, Catherine found Pearl alone in the laundry room, washing linens in water turned gray with soap. Catherine sent the other workers away on pretended errands, waiting until they were alone before speaking. "I know you have been watching," Catherine said quietly. "I know you see everything here just as I do. And I know you understand what my husband is doing." Pearl's hand stilled in the wash water. She looked at Catherine with intelligent eyes, assessing, calculating risk. After a long moment, she said carefully, "What is it you want to know, Mrs.? Everything you think I should know. Everything that might help me stop this." Pearl glanced toward the door, ensuring they were truly alone. Then she spoke in a low voice, her words precise, despite the danger of what she revealed. "There is something Master Brennan has kept hidden from you, a boy. His name is Samuel. He was born 8 years ago, before you came to Sweetwater. His mother was a woman named Judith, who worked in the house. Master Brennan kept Samuel because he was the firstborn, looking almost white, with gray eyes and light hair like his own. Judith was sold to Alabama when Samuel was weaned, and the boy has lived in a separate cabin ever since." Catherine felt ice spread through her chest. "Why have I never seen this child? Master Brennan keeps him apart. He has been teaching Samuel tools, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, things he does not allow the rest of us to learn. I have heard him and Dr. Harav talking about the boy. They say Samuel is proof that their breeding theories work." Mrs. Pearl's voice dropped lower. "They plan to use him when he reaches manhood, to father children himself. They want to create a line of people who look white, but are still property under the law. People they can sell for fortunes to buyers who want servants that could pass in white society." The horror struck Catherine like a physical blow. Nathaniel had fathered a son and was grooming him to continue the cycle of exploitation. Become another instrument of the same violation that had brought him into existence. A legacy of trauma designed to perpetuate itself across generations. "Where is this boy kept?" Catherine asked. "In a cabin on the east side of the property, past the barn. Master Brennan visits him most afternoons for lessons. You should know Samuel is smart, very smart. He understands what he is, what Master Brennan plans for him. I have seen the look in his eyes. He is angry, waiting for something. I do not know what, but he is not the obedient tool Master Brennan thinks he has created." Catherine left the laundry room with Pearl's words echoing in her mind. Samuel, a son Nathaniel had kept, trained, shaped for some darker purpose. She needed to see the boy to understand what 8 years under Nathaniel's instruction had produced. That evening at dinner, Catherine took a calculated risk. She mentioned casually that she had heard there was a child at Sweetwater receiving an education. How unusual that seemed. Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his gray eyes fixing on her sharply. "Where did you hear that?" His voice was controlled, but the warning beneath it was clear. "Servants talk," Catherine said with practiced indifference. "I pay attention to my household." Nathaniel set down his fork carefully. "Samuel is part of the project. An experiment in potential. He shows what careful selection and training can produce. I would like to meet him." "No," Nathaniel said, his gaze steady, I have been present for every other aspect of this work. I have documented births, recorded traits, witnessed things that will haunt me forever. Why should I not meet this child who is apparently so important to your vision? Silence stretched between them like a tangible weight. She could see him calculating, weighing if her request posed a real threat. His illness had made him cautious, less sure of his control. Finally, he nodded once. Tomorrow afternoon. But you will observe only. You will not speak to him unless I allow it, and you will certainly not interfere with his education. The next day dragged with anticipation bordering on dread. Catherine moved through morning tasks mechanically, her mind focused on the coming meeting. When Nathaniel came to collect her after the midday meal, she followed him across the yard toward a cabin set apart from the slave quarters. It was better built than the others, with glass windows instead of shutters, and a small porch with steps. Inside, the space was spare but clean. A narrow bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding books Catherine recognized from Nathaniel's library, and at a small desk near the window, a boy sat working through arithmetic problems on a slate, his handwriting neat and precise. Samuel looked up when they entered. Catherine's breath caught. The resemblance to Nathaniel was unmistakable. The angular face, set jaw, those pale gray eyes, but his tone was lighter than she had expected. Light enough that, in different clothes, in a different context, he might pass unquestioned in white society. His hair was brown with golden light streaked across his forehead as he studied them. Samuel, this is Mrs. Brennan. Nathaniel's voice carried a tone Catherine had never heard before, almost like pride. The boy stood straight, performing a formal bow that showed careful training. Good afternoon, Mrs. Elf, Mrs. Forrest, Brennan. His speech was perfect, without the dialect that marked most enslaved people's words. Someone had worked hard to remove that. It is good to meet you, Samuel. Catherine managed. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask questions, wanted to know what the child felt and thought behind that controlled expression. But Nathaniel watched her closely for the next half hour. Nathaniel demonstrated Samuel's skills like a man showing off a prized horse. The boy read from books far beyond what most 8-year-olds could handle. He solved math problems with ease. He answered questions on history and geography accurately, showing evidence of long hours of study. Through it all, his face revealed nothing. When they finally walked back to the main house, Nathaniel spoke with barely contained satisfaction. You see, he proves that the theories work. With proper breeding and education, extraordinary results are possible. In 10 years, when he reaches adulthood, he will be ready for the next phase. What next phase? Catherine asked, though a cold certainty was growing in her stomach. He will father children of his own. I have been corresponding with Calloway about suitable matches. There are plantations with girls from similar programs. We will pair them based on optimal traits. Samuel's children will represent the peak of what we've learned. Catherine stopped walking. You are planning to use your own son as breeding stock. He is not my son legally, Nathaniel said calmly. He is property, highly valuable property, but property nonetheless, and he will serve the purpose for which he was created. It is no different than using a prize bull to improve cattle. He is a child, a human child. Nathaniel's face hardened. He is a tool in a grand experiment. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment, Catherine. Sentiment has no place in scientific progress. That night, Catherine sat with her hidden diary open, but could not write. The horror of Nathaniel's plan for Samuel overshadowed even other atrocities. This was not just exploitation. It was the creation of a self-perpetuating system of abuse, designed to continue across generations. Samuel would be forced to inflict on others what had been done to his mother, creating children trapped in the same cycle. She had to stop it. But how? Nathaniel held all power. The law was on his side. Even if she helped Samuel escape, where could he go? How would a light-skinned child of ambiguous status survive in a world demanding clear categories? The answer came to her, simple and terrible. She needed a powerful ally, someone whose moral authority carried weight, someone who could not be dismissed or threatened. She needed someone outside the plantation system, with connections beyond Georgia. She needed a minister. Reverend Thomas Gaines arrived in Milledgeville in early August, assigned to the Presbyterian Church by the Northern Synod. He was 35, unmarried, a Princeton Theological Seminary graduate, and soon revealed dangerously progressive views on slavery. Not abolitionist, he was careful, but he preached Christian duty, treating all people as God's children, warning of the spiritual dangers of absolute power. Catherine attended his first sermon, sitting in the Brennan pew, listening as he emphasized the parable of the Good Samaritan, making some plantation owners shift uncomfortably. Afterward, she introduced herself politely and said she would value his counsel on difficult spiritual matters. Reverend Gaines had intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see more than people wanted to show. "I would be honored, Mrs. Brennan. Shall I call it Sweetwater?" "That would be most appropriate," Catherine said, aware of Nathaniel watching from across the church lawn. "My husband and I would be pleased to receive you." The minister's first visit came the following Tuesday. Catherine prepared carefully, ensuring Nathaniel would be present, everything appearing proper. They sat in the front parlor drinking tea, discussing theology with the careful politeness of strangers establishing boundaries. When Reverend Gaines asked to tour the plantation to understand his congregants' lives, Harine saw her chance. Nathaniel could hardly refuse without suspicion, so he agreed, hiding his reluctance. Catherine led the tour with Nathaniel trailing, breathing heavily. They passed the slave quarters when people were visible. Ruth held little Martha, now a year old. Grace stood by the cabin door, that hollow look never changing. Pearl moved between buildings, her pregnancy obvious, careful and deliberate. "You have a large population here," Reverend Gaines observed, neutrally, but his gaze lingered on the women and children, noting details. "Sweetwater is prosperous," Nathaniel said. "We manage resources efficiently." "Resources," the minister repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that is one way to describe people." The tension was palpable. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They returned to the house, and Reverend Gaines left, promising to return for further discussions. After the carriage disappeared, Nathaniel turned to Catherine. "What are you doing?" "Seeking spiritual guidance," Catherine said calmly. "Is that not a Christian woman's duty?" "You have involved me in many things, Nathaniel. My conscience requires counsel." "Be careful, Catherine. Very careful." The minister did return repeatedly over the weeks. Sometimes Nathaniel was present. Sometimes he remained in his room from fatigue, leaving Catherine to meet Reverend Gaines alone with Pearl serving tea, a silent reminder of what they discussed. Catherine spoke carefully, never directly about the breeding program. Instead, she asked theoretical questions. What is a Christian's duty when witnessing sin? When complicit but powerless, what should one do? How to balance obedience to earthly authority with divine law? Reverend Gaines was cautious, yet Catherine noticed the understanding in his eyes. He began asking gentle questions about the children at Sweetwater, their fathers, what happy, into babies born on the plantation. Catherine answered with gestures and meaningful silences, letting him piece the truth together. In mid-September, Pearl went into labor suddenly that afternoon. Catherine attended as Nathaniel required, though he avoided the actual delivery. Pearl labored 6 hours, sweat slick on her face, hands gripping the bed frame until knuckles turned white. The baby finally came. A girl lighter than Pearl but darker than Samuel. Catherine wrapped the infant and placed her in her mother's arms. "Her name is Grace," Pearl said, voice hoarse from screaming. After witnessing so much loss, Catherine looked at this woman who had risked everything and endured agony. "I will not let them take her," Catherine whispered. "I promise, Pearl, whatever it costs, I will not let them take this baby." That night, Nathaniel inspected Pearl's baby, ledger in hand, noting characteristics and potential value. Catherine watched, furious. When he finished, she followed him to his study. "This one stays," Catherine said. Nathaniel looked up. "That is not your decision." I am deciding. Pearl's baby will remain with her mother. And if I disagree, I will go to Reverend Gaines and tell him everything. Every part of your program, every child sold through Callaway, every aspect of your grand experiment. I will give him names, dates, and documentation. I will destroy you, Nathaniel. It was risky. Nathaniel could still silence her, but his illness weakened him. More importantly, Reverend Gaines' presence in Milledgeville changed the stakes. The minister had northern connections who would listen if accusations came from clergy rather than a supposedly hysterical woman. Nathaniel studied her. You think you have power here? You can dictate terms to me in my own house. I think we both have something to lose, Catherine said. And you are practical enough to see a stalemate. Pearl's baby stays. That is the price for my silence. One child, that is all you ask. Catherine pressed further. No more women selected for your program. What has been done is done, but no more. You ask me to abandon years of work. I ask you to stop committing evil in the name of science. Refuse, and I will ensure everything you built comes crashing down, even if it destroys me. The standoff lasted days. Nathaniel neither agreed nor withdrew into silence. Catherine held firm, meeting Reverend Gaines, documenting in her diary. Pearl stayed with baby Grace, uncertain whether the child would be taken like so many others. Then one late September evening, everything shifted. Just when Catherine thought she gained some control over Sweetwater's horrors, new challenges arose that would test her courage and resolve to the absolute limit. If this story grips you, share it with someone who enjoys complex historical mysteries. Hit like and subscribe so you never miss our explorations of America's hidden past.